Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Christopher Lane. I'm the chair of the history department here at Christendom College. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexander O'Hara, who has agreed to be with us today. Dr. O'Hara is a historian of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, specializing in monastic history and theology, as well as the medieval cult of the saints and medieval Latin literary culture. And since he'll be speaking to us today about the Irish experience of pilgrimage and exile, I think it's appropriate to mention just some of the scholarly peregrinations of this Irishman. He earned his M.A. In medieval history in 2004 from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, his Master of Studies in Historical Research with a focus on medieval studies from the University of Oxford in the year 2006. In 2009, he earned his PhD in medieval history from the University of St. Andrews. He has taught or held appointments as a research fellow at a number of universities and other academic institutions, including, again, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Vienna, the Institute for Medieval Research of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, the Moore Institute for Research in the Humanities and Social Sciences of the National University of Ireland in Galway, as well as Trinity College, Dublin. And he is presently coming to us from sunny Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he is a Fulbright and visiting scholar in the Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. Among his other awards, grants, and scholarships are the National Heritage Award from the Heritage Council in Ireland, the Ernst Mach Scholarship, and the Norwegian Government Research Scholarship of the Center for Viking and Medieval Studies at the University of Oslo. His peer-reviewed and other publications, conference papers, invited lectures, and other scholarly activities would take far too long for me to enumerate, and I think you want to hear from him more than from me today. But I will mention his books. He is the author of Jonas of Bobbio and the Legacy of Columbanus, Sanctity and Community in the 7th Century. He's the editor of Columbanus and the Peoples of Post-Roman Europe. Both of those are from Oxford University Press in 2018. He put out a translation through Liverpool University Press in 2017 of Jonas of Bobbio's Life of Columbanus, Life of John, and Life of Vedast. Did I pronounce that right? Okay, good. And more recently, he's the co-editor of Saint Sunniva, Irish Queen, Norwegian patron saint, which was put out by Bergen in 2021, a collected volume on the medieval cult of the Irish Saint Sunniva, patron of Bergen and Western Norway. And finally, this year, he was also appointed the National Director for Catechetics for the island of Ireland by the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference. His talk is entitled Freemen, Outwith the Tribe, Exiles for Christ from St. Patrick to Kilian, 400 to 700 AD. Please give him a warm Christendom welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Lane, and to the History Department for this very kind invitation to speak to you, and to all at Christendom College, President O'Donnell. It's a real privilege and a pleasure for me to be here. It's not every day you see a new Gothic chapel being put up, and I had a fantastic tour by Patrick today. We went up to the roof, and because when I was driving up the road, I was like, no, that can't be a Gothic church. So it's amazing. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Chris, for the invitation. So I wanted to start this evening really with my favorite piece of Christian sculpture from early medieval Ireland. It's called the Bantry Pillar Stone, or the Kilnaruan Pillar Stone in County Kerry. And you see here it's a rather forlorn-looking pillar stuck in the middle of a field. Well, it was actually an early monastic site, and you can see there the sea not too far away. It's from around the 8th century, but it's the earliest depiction of a curragh, as type of early Irish boat, is a leather-bound boat, and it's quite unusual because the boat is pointing upwards, and we see here little crosses, and there's 4 men in the boat, and there's a steersman. And of course, this is the four evangelists and Christ steering the boat, sailing through a cross of seas. So it's the ship of the church, and I think it's a beautiful image for what we're going to be talking about today. It's also I can use it as an image for the five saints we're going to be mainly focusing on for this talk. St. Patrick, so in the 5th century, who of course was British, Romano-Briton, and four Irish exile saints, Columba, Viona, or Columcille, Columbanus, both from the 6th centuries, and then Furza or Furzy in the 7th century, and finding Kilian, whose cafe this is named after. So that's roughly, we're going to be going from really 400 to around 700 AD. So the life of Jesus of Nazareth was lived on the eastern margins of the Roman Empire in a remote corner of Palestine. Prior to his ascension on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem, he promised his disciples that they would soon receive the power of the Holy Spirit and be his witnesses even to the ends of the earth. At the conclusion of Matthew's Gospel, the risen Jesus commissions his disciples in Galilee to make disciples of all nations and baptize them, promising to be with them in their ministry to the end of the world. Some 400 years later, when the Roman Empire in the West was collapsing, the Evangelion, or good news about Jesus the Saviour, came to Ireland in the person of a slave. The upper-class Romano-Briton Patricius, who we now know as St. Patrick, was captured by Irish pirates while a teenager growing up in Western Britain. He would have been well aware of Ireland's notorious reputation in the social imaginary of the late antique world. As a slave and a shepherd on the west of Ireland, he would have been in no doubt that he had come to the ends of the earth. Because Ireland and the Irish were synonymous with barbarism and savagery in the Roman colonial imagination. It was a place where ethnographic fantasies and imagined geographies could be projected, a classical precursor to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Patrick's near contemporary, the great biblical scholar St. Jerome, claimed to have witnessed Irish acts of cannibalism as a young man. And around this time, a new word came to be applied to the Irish, scotus, or scoti in the plural, which literally means a shady character or a knifesman, and likely comes from Brythonic, a precursor to Welsh. And with no disrespect intended for our Scottish cousins, Scotland literally means the land of the dodgy people. But it was, of course, a term first applied to Ireland and the Irish. For Patrick, the slave who had found God in Ireland, when he later returned as a bishop, Ireland's remoteness and liminality had now paradoxically become central to salvation history. By the preaching of the gospel in Ireland, Christ's mandate to his apostles had been fulfilled. This heralded the parousia, or Christ's second coming, and the end time, giving a sense of urgency and dynamism to this period. For the colonial elites of the Roman world, the Irish had been considered less than human, beyond the pale in terms of Christianization, but through the ministry of missionaries like Patrick, they had now become incorporated into the universal body of Christ. So Patrick gives us the first glimpse into the early Irish church. He writes about converts to religious life and the early monastics and consecrated women who joined him. Patrick even identifies himself as the first honorary Irishman. In writing to the British slavers, the soldiers of the warlord Coroticus, who had captured and enslaved some of his Irish converts to sell to pagans, Patrick writes that it is scandalous to them that we are Irish. indignum est illis Hiberionaci sumus. This is again from Patrick's Confessio from the 5th century. Again, that the gospel had come to the ends of the world. And this is from the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. The translation here is that a disgrace that we are from Ireland, but it actually means that we are Irish in the Latin. By his remarkable assertion, Patrick reveals the ethnic disdain and condescension that must have been typical of late Roman colonial attitudes towards the Irish. Like in the film The Mission, where the early Jesuit missionaries in Latin America identify with and take the side of their indigenous converts in response to Portuguese colonial efforts to exploit and enslave them for profit, Patrick similarly took the side of his exploited converts. This is the only place in both of his writings where Patrick specifically identifies with the Irish, as he generally refers to Ireland and the Irish as Hiberiones and Scoti. And at the beginning of his letter, he refers to the Irish as barbarian Gentiles, barbaras gentes. His self-identification remained fundamentally Roman. Now, in identifying with the Irish, he appears to be modeling St. Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians, though I am free and belong to no one, I've made it myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. So through the grace of baptism, ethnic divisions have been erased. And Patrick further cites Malachi here. Do you not have one God? Why have you abandoned each one of you his own neighbor? So for Patrick, conversion and baptism had turned a once idolatrous people into a people of God, as he writes in his Confessio. Whence, moreover, in Ireland, those who never had notice of God, up to now they always worship nothing except idols and unclean things. How recently a people of the Lord has been made, and they are named sons of God. And this is actually a picture of an idol that was only discovered this year in a bog in County Roscommon, and it's 8 feet tall. The head is kind of up here, and it's been carbon dated to just before 412, so around the time that Patrick would have before his mission. So again, this is literally an idol that's been recently discovered. Now, of course, when writing of Patrick, we are really dealing with two distinct cultural subjects. The historical Patrick, who wrote the two 5th century autobiographical documents that survive, and the hagiographical Patrick, who comes from two distinct late 7th century works of hagiography that were written to promote the cult of St. Patrick. So I want to briefly look about how these two hagiographers write about Ireland and the Irish. So in the first one, written by Muircu, written in the late 7th century, the author depicts the dramatic conversion of Ireland by Patrick, who is really represented as a kind of second Moses figure. He refers to Ireland as this barbarian island, and to the Irish Sea as our sea. Ireland is this island in the cold north to which Bishop Palladius was sent by Pope Celestin in 431, where the Irish were unwilling to accept his teaching. When Patrick arrived in Ireland, he went to the High King Logara at Tara, who is described as an emperor of non-Romans, with Tara being his caput Scotorum, or the capital of the Irish. And Muircu talks about his dynasty, the Enail, as holding the kingship of almost the entire island. So Muircu mentions the different kingdoms of Ireland, but the focus is very much on Tara and the plain of Brega around Tara, because it was there that that there was the greatest kingdom among the tribes, the head of all paganism and idolatry. And he refers to it as the Egypt of this, our island. And again, this is a depiction of the hill of Tara looking over the wide expanse of the plain of Brega. And Tara, or Chaur, literally means sanctuary. Comes from temenos in Greek, so kind of a sanctuary or temple. And again, a depiction of another idol. And Patrick, he begins his kind of confrontation with the High King and his druids by lighting the paschal fire on the Hill of Slain nearby in defiance of the High King. And this is shown as a kind of baptism of Ireland and the Irish. So it's when he led the people of Ireland into the true religion that Easter night. And the subsequent dramatic showdown with the king and his druids vindicates Christianity as the more powerful religion. But Murku very much emphasizes that this is not an unequal match. He very much posits the druids and the native indigenous belief system as a meeting of equals. So to highlight that there is much glory in Ireland as in any of the courts which the Word of God has previously encountered. So it's very much an equal match. The other hagiographical work on Patrick, written around the same time, is that by an author called Tyracon, known as the Colectinea. So this is showing kind of the different areas in Ireland, different regions, with the various dynasties that rule. So the Northern Enail, the Southern Enail, that's Tara is here near Dublin. So that's what we're really talking about here at the moment. But Tyracon's focus was very much on Connacht, the part of the country that I'm from in the west. And Tyracon's account really reads like a kind of travelled narrative through Ireland. But he shows a strong regional, tribal and territorial interest, but always framed within the context that Patrick is a bishop over Ireland, whose primacy over the whole island and its people has been given to him by God. And okay, I think that's paused. Oh yeah, thanks. So again, the Irish don't come across that well in Tyracon's account. So the deserters, arch robbers, warlords. But in travelling in Connacht, Patrick climbed Cruachan Agli, now known as Crowpatrick. Yeah. In County Mayo. So this is showing the hordes of pilgrims still going up the mountain, usually in July. And that's it there. It's a very unusual kind of a pyramidal. It was certainly a pre-Christian cult site, probably to do with sun worship. And they've actually, that little dot there is a church on the top. Many of you may have been there. But remarkably, It was really severe in Constantinople, now Istanbul, but it went throughout the West, and so they've estimated 40% death rate in some places. Population decline 25%, and in some places 60% population decline. So really, really severe. Not as severe as the Black Death in the 14th century, but quite significant. And it's following this period of endemic plague that the Irish church begins to turn outwards. By this time, the Irish had long established colonies in Western Britain, and the Irish church had been formed by both missionaries coming from the British and Gaelic churches. This is a new icon that was written by one of Ireland's leading iconographers called Clark, and it's of Columba or St. Columba of Iona. And this year marks the 15th centenary of the saint's birth. He was born in 521 in County Donegal, and the O'Donnells claim him as one of their ancestors. But it's a beautiful icon, and so we're celebrating him this year. Well, he was 41 in 563 when he left Northern Ireland with 12 other monks and sailed across to Britain. He was received by the King of Scottish Dalriata, who supported his monastic foundation on the island of Iona in the Outer Hebrides. So Columba was a member of the Northern Enail. We saw that map there. He's born in County Donegal. And the Enail were the most powerful royal dynasty in Ireland, and his cousin became High King of Ireland. Columba himself would have been eligible for the High Kingship if he didn't enter the church. So he was from the highest rungs of the Irish royal dynasties. By leaving Ireland as an ascetic exile or peregrinus, Columba could further pursue his monastic vocation unencumbered by the dynastic squabbles in Ireland. He could still act as a typical late antique holy man, brokering peace deals, prophesying, cursing, and preaching, but exile gave the middle-aged monk a fresh canvas to work from. Most of what we know about Columba comes from Adamnan, the ninth abbot of Iona and a descendant of the saint's kin, who wrote about 100 years after Columba's death, but who drew upon an extensive dossier based on oral and written accounts that had been compiled soon after the saint's death. So Adamnan's Vita Columbae, or the life of St. Columba, is one of the most remarkable saints' lives from the early Middle Ages, a work of magical surrealism akin to the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The unusual structure of the work in 3 parts or books, dealing with Columba's miracles, prophecies, and angelic visions, and lack of narrative chronology, gives the impression of staccato blog posts in which the saint appears as an ethereal and rather eccentric figure. But Adamnan's purpose was to write a hagiography at the bequest of the Iona community, most likely to commemorate the first centenary of the saint's death. So Columba died in 597. We think that Adamnan finished his life Columba in 697, so 100 years later. But he clearly drew upon long-standing oral traditions. And his portrait of Columba is of a man full of the Holy Spirit, a man who enjoyed the company of angels, and who was gifted with foreknowledge and prophetic powers. Adamnan was, of course, an accomplished theologian, having written a book on the holy places in Jerusalem some years before. And it has been argued that both this work and the life of Columba should be read as a kind of a diptych. It now appears that the monastic layout on Iona, particularly under the abbacy of Adamnan, was consciously modelled on Jerusalem and the layout of the Holy Sepulchre. so that Iona has been referred to as the Jerusalem of the North. This is a fantastic article which you'll find online. It's open access. This is just showing the layout of the Holy Sepulchre on the left in Jerusalem, as described by Adovnon in his book on the Holy Places. And then this is the kind of layout for Iona at the same period. So you'll see similarities. And then this is a picture of Iona, and there's with some of the place names from the island. So the whole island was considered a sacred place, a locus sanctus, with the monastic enclosure and the church located within the monastic enclosure, marking progressive gradients of sacred space. And they actually copied the temple in Jerusalem in terms of 3 progressively more holy places in terms of the monastic layout. So they're really very much looking to biblical exemplars and to Jerusalem. We saw in the icon Columba depicted as a scribe. He was remembered as a poet, and Ireland's oldest manuscript of the Psalter and the earliest example of Irish writing, called the Cathach, or the Battler, because it was brought into battle by the O'Donnell dynasty. This was considered a relic of the saint. It could have been written by the saint's own hand. It certainly, the dating would make that possible. And so Colette Clark, she copied the writing in terms of the icon, so that piece of script, and that's the case of the Psalter. But it's the earliest example of Irish writing, and it was certainly venerated as a relic of the saint. And scholars think that a number of hymns have also been ascribed to Columba. Their focus is very much on the concern for the last things, and they give us a sense of his theological outlook, but not much else. But an elegy was written in Old Irish after Columba's death by a man called Dálan, known as the Amra Columcille, and it was commissioned by Columba's relative, the High King, Éed Mac Amneric, who had been the king of Kinnail-Connell, the region where Columba was from, and who became the High King of Ireland. And the poet was writing for a mixed audience of secular nobles and Columba's monastic contemporaries. But Dálan really turns things upside down, because he's espousing the norms of Gaelic poetry in praise of a dead hero. But he's presenting Columba as a new kind of ascetic hero that subverts secular warrior ideals. The focus is very much on Columba's royal dynastic and familial connections. But in a sense, Columba is a Christian anti-hero who turns secular aristocratic conventions on their head. So the title for this talk is taken from the fact that the poet emphasizes that the total renunciation of Columba. From among an idolatrous people, he abandoned possessions. A free man outwith the tribe. Thus I declare, the son of Fidelmid, he forgot the tribe, he knew his end. And his motive for leaving Ireland is ascribed to his having a fear of hell. A covenant is mentioned with the king of Scottish Dalriata, who in the Annals of Ulster is said to have granted Iona to Columba. But again, the poet refers disparagingly to the Irish people as an idolatrous people. But certainly the context for Columba's leaving Ireland, that it was purgative, would fit with Adamnon's later dating of his exile following the Battle of Culdrevna in 561, in which Columba's kin defeated the High King, and which was obviously the political background to Columba's ascetic exile. So this is showing the area of the Battle of Culdrevna in County Sligo, and on two occasions, Adamnon dates Columba's leaving Ireland from this battle. In Fóréir Colum by Beckon Mac Ligdoch, a Columban monk and hermit writing about 50 years after Columba's death, he clarifies that Columba crucified his body on the grey waves, not for crimes, so not for a criminal offence, but voluntarily. He says that Columba left Ireland, entered a pact. He crossed in ships the whale shrine, a bold man over the sea's ridge. So the poet is stating that Columba's exile was covenantal and voluntary, presumably establishing a covenant with God. And he's referred to as Britain's beacon, and metaphors of light and candles abound. And this is continued in another poem by Beckon, where the poet notes that in scores of currachs, we've seen a currach at the very beginning of the lecture, with an army of wretches, he crossed the long-haired sea, and he brought northward to meet the Lord a bright crowd of chancels. So this is another of my favorite works of early Christian sculpture, also from around the 8th century. It's called the Monk's Stone, and it's from Shetland in the Northern Isles. And you see here, these are monks crossing the sea. The abbot is riding a horse, and they're coming to the cross, and they have a little gospel book there. Beautiful depiction. So kind of depicting what we know is happening from this period onwards. Irish monks going out into the ocean looking for a place of retreat, generally seasonal. But this element in terms of what Beckon talks about going northward to meet the Lord. And of course, in the biblical worldview, the north was the direction of evil, seen in Jeremiah 1, while the gospel during Mass was proclaimed facing the north in the hope of converting the barbarians to Christ. This was where Gog of the land of Magog would come to deceive the nations. In the prophet Ezekiel, God says to Gog, "You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land." While in the book of Revelation states that when 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. So I think we have to imagine what were these Irish monks doing on places like Skellig Michael here off the coast of Kerry, or in God-forsaken islands in the Shetlands or in the Northern Islands. What were they doing? Well, I think an analogy in terms of, many of you might have watched Game of Thrones, the people on the wall and looking out northwards, this enemy coming. That's what they're doing essentially. They're seeing themselves as warriors for Christ, and these are bulwarks of prayer, but they're facing north. They're going out in the direction of the north. And we miss a lot of this. We fail to understand a lot of what they were doing if we don't have this perspective in mind. And again, this image of Columba being a candle and a light, the poet talks about him piercing the midnight of Irk's region, so referring to Scottish Dalriata, this idea of light illuminating the darkness. So Beccon was a member of the Ineal, as were most of Columba's abbatial successors. So the familial and dynastic associations in the earliest Columban poetry is not surprising. And this is also the case in Adamnan's Life of Columba, where Columba's familial and regional links come to the fore. Adamnan is conscious of ethnic identities, but Ireland and the Irish are mentioned in passing without any particular weight. There's no sense in Adamnan of Ireland or the Irish as being a holy people or a people set apart. And he's even disparaging about the Gaelic language at the very beginning of his Life of Columba. He in particular notes patronymics and tribal affiliations of many of the Ionan monks and others outside the community. While his interest in the Holy Land is obvious, and Iona appears to have been modelled on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, his writing about Ireland and the Irish, we can say, is neutral. So just turning to our next saint, so Columba's near contemporary and namesake, often confused or mixed up. He's known as Columba the Younger, or Columbanus. He's a generation younger than Columba. And these two beautiful icons, again, were written by Colette Clark for Bangor Church in Northern Ireland. We have here St. Columbanus, and this is his disciple, St. Gall, with the very helpful bear here providing a piece of wood for the fire. So St. Gall was said to have found his hermitage because he tripped over, and that was seen then as a divine sign that this was the place to establish his hermitage. And again, talking about archaeological discoveries, it's remarkable what we're still finding. In St. Gallen, they've been having excavations the last few years, and they've discovered a base of a round tower in St. Gallen, and also a skeleton. So this is showing Columbanus's travels on the continent. And for those of you who don't know, he's the patron saint of motorbikers. And I never knew why. So I actually bumped into an Italian biker, and he said, well, the reason why is that from Genoa up to Bobbio, it's a very famous road, and it's very, very winding and very dangerous. So the tradition is that when you get to Bobbio, you would go down into the crypt and you'd say a prayer of thanksgiving that you arrived alive. So that's it. So Columbanus, he's a monk in Bangor Abbey in County Down, who leaves there in 590. And he's left us with the most complete literary corpus of any early Irish saint. And he would have been born around the time that the Justinianic plague was raging in the mid-6th century. Accompanied again by 12 monks. Again, we have this Christological element. You need a full quorum of 12 monks to establish an abbey, but there's also a Christological element, of course, as well. And he headed south to continental Europe, drawn to the pull of Rome. And it's interesting that all of his monasteries are dedicated to St. Peter. And particularly in Burgundy, where he establishes his main monasteries, he seems to be copying the sacred topography of Rome. Particularly his third monastery is dedicated to St. Pancras, which is quite unusual. Of course, Pancras being a Roman martyr saint, but we know that Pope Gregory the Great had a great devotion to Pancras, and it's thought that Gregory the Great gave relics of Pancras to St. Augustine and the Roman mission on their way to Anglo-Saxon England, and they would have gone through Luxeuil. So Columbanus' third foundation is dedicated to St. Pancras. And in his letters to successive popes, Columbanus emphasized Ireland's liminality at the ends of the earth and the orthodoxy of the Christian faith in Ireland, which he says was brought from Rome and which has been maintained. So he stressed the orthodoxy of the early Irish church. This is He's also the first person to express an Irish sense of identity in writing. So in a letter to Pope Boniface IV, written from Milan in 613, 2 years before his death, Columbanus reassured the Pope that the Irish were and had always been Orthodox. And again, he emphasizes the liminality of Ireland. Yet Ireland's peripherality was precisely what, according to Columbanus, contributed to the pristine and orthodox nature of the Catholic faith in Ireland. In an Italy riven by political and religious divisions at this time, Columbanus emphasized that the Catholic faith had been preserved untarnished in Ireland. And Columbanus' more inclusive and ideological view of Ireland influenced or shared by other Irish exiles in a circle. In the hagiography that was written about him 2 decades after Columbanus' death, so a lot nearer in time than Adamnon's, the Italian monk Jonas of Bobbio inserted a very unusual poem on Ireland. It's actually the earliest poem about Ireland, and you're going to read it now, at the beginning of his work. This is it. And it's written in a very complex Hiberno Latin that was very nasty to translate. So you're very blessed to have the translation. But it was written by probably a monk of Columbanus, because it was certainly written by an Irishman, because it refers to the coast of Ireland as our famous shores. So probably penned by one of Columbanus' Irish companions who had accompanied the saint. So it states that Columbanus was born on the island of Ireland, stresses the notion of Ireland's remoteness, but it immediately becomes clear that it's not about the saint at all. It's actually, it's about the sun setting off the west coast of Ireland and it's rising again in the east. This is quite an evocative, strange poem about the sun setting and rising in the west and going to the east. And this is, but it's following a reverse circuit of the sun, so it's going via the north. And this is perhaps alluding to Ecclesiastes 1. The sun rises, the sun sets, then to its place it speeds, and there it rises. Southward goes the wind, then turns to the north. It turns and turns again, back then to its circling goes the wind. But of course, east is where Christ will return at the end of time, while, as we've seen, the north was the place of evil, where retribution will come from. So the poem is essentially about resurrection, about renewal, decline and renewal, of triumph over the forces of darkness. And of course, for the early Christians, Christ was often associated with the sun as the sun of righteousness, the Christos Helios, as seen here in a 3rd century mosaic in the mausoleum of the Julii under St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, which shows Jesus as a Sol Invictus driving the horses of the sun's chariot. Columbanus, in his letter to Pope Boniface IV, calls Christ the supreme driver of that chariot, true father, charioteer of Israel, alluding to 4 Kings, where the prophet Elijah ascends to heaven in a fiery chariot. So in Columbanus' letter, the coming of Christianity to Ireland is presented as a sun that rises in the east and crosses the sky into the west. Now that the sun has reached Ireland, it has reached its furthest point in the west and its journey is complete. So for Columbanus, the conversion of Ireland marked the culmination of the process of Christianization. He accredits this as the work of the Roman Church, for the chariot of Christ was drawn by Saints Peter and Paul. The conversion of the Irish marked the realization of Rome's universal mission. And the preeminence of Rome for Columbanus rested on its status as a burial place of the apostles, Peter and Paul, and as the epicenter of Christianity in the West, not on the fact that it had been a great world empire. So in contrast to earlier perceptions, Columbanus stressed the inclusiveness of Ireland as a member of the universal church. And as we've already seen, now that the gospel had been preached to the ends of the world, the eschaton was imminent. Columbanus and his monks, taking the message of the gospel of Christ, the Son, from the west back east into the heartlands of the former Roman Empire, heralded Christ's imminent return and the end of time. But Jonas inserted this poem at the very beginning of his life of Columbanus because it precedes his account of Columbanus' birth and a miracle in which the saint's mother saw a vision of the sun shining from her womb that illuminates the whole world. Of course, the sun is the biblical lux of John 1:9, the true light that enlightens everyone. It is symbolic of Christ, the light of the world, but also of Columbanus and his monks who, like the sun in the poem, traveled from west to east. And we see this kind of imagery played out in later works of hagiography about Columbanus and his disciple Gallus. But the first poem about Ireland is a tantalizing testament to how these men perceive the homeland they left behind and their mission as exiles from the ends of the earth. And this is what Jonas writes following this poem, and it really marks the beginning of a new perception of Ireland and as a sacred place. This is completely novel, and it's the antithesis to the classical and late antique perception. And Jonas's perception was no doubt the result of his contact with Irish monks in Bobbio, where where his monastic formation was undertaken, who could voice their native and alternative image of Ireland rather than that of the ancient Greek and Roman ethnographers. So Columbanus was informed by a Pauline theology that saw all baptized peoples as being part of the body of Christ. Christianity provided a universal sense of fraternity to this exile conscious of operating in a complex pluralist society, and concord and unity were key themes in his writings. But again, there's the same eschatological scaffolding as we find in Patrick's writing, reflecting a common early Irish theological perspective. Columbanus reveals for the first time how an Irish person understood his homeland within the perspective of salvation history. And emerging from this eschatological theology, a new perception of Ireland and the Irish arose, which is most fully seen in this first poem about Ireland. So I'm just going to skip over briefly Furza or Furzy, who is well worth looking into. This is a Kilursa in County Galway, and a statue there of Furza. It's very near my hometown. But it was there that in the 620s, Furza received a number of what we call nowadays near-death experiences, but visions of heaven and hell. And they were very influential. They were written down soon after his death. He's the first Irish exile to Anglo-Saxon England. So he goes there in 633. And he was given this Roman fort, Burr Castle in Norfolk, by the local Anglo-Saxon king. And he remains there until there's kind of a pagan incursion, and it becomes unsafe. And then he sails across to Gaul, Merovingian Gaul, what we now know as France, in the 640s, and he's given protection there by a very powerful Frankish noble who, after his death, essentially takes his body, the saint's body, to his private chapel, which he's having built in Peron, his estate, and the cult of Furza develops there. So it becomes known as Perona Scotorum, or Peron of the Irish, and it's where the cult of Furza is really fostered. So the account that was written, it's called the Transitus Beati Furzi, or the Visio Furzi, and it really focuses on the visions of heaven and hell, and it's an important document for, I suppose, the development of purgatory, and also the influence of the penitentials, the Irish penitentials, and of course Bede drew upon this account for his account of Furza in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which he completed in 731. But again, Ireland does not come out well from this account. The author was certainly not Irish, but he doesn't show that much interest in Ireland or the Irish, and gives kind of a neutral account. I just wanted to briefly mention there's a number of cases where we have a kind of reverse peregrinatio or reverse exile by continental monks who want to go to Ireland as exiles themselves. And one of these is a Frankish warrior who becomes a monk called Wandrigisel, now known as Saint-Wandri in France. And this is the community still in existence or resurrected after the French Revolution. And if you know that beautiful book by Patrick Leigh Fermor, A Time to Keep Silence, well, he wrote that in Saint-Wandri. He used to go there on retreats. But in the earliest account of the saint's life, he talks, or he says that he wants to go to Ireland on pilgrimage. And the same is expressed by a monk, Autiernus, a Frankish monk, in Jonas's Vita Columbani. And we see a kind of a testing of this. Is this from the Holy Spirit? And a kind of a ritual of testing this desire, because Columbanus tells him to go off into the woods and fast and take one loaf of bread and then see what happens. And of course, it was from Ireland that the English monks, such as the Northumbrian missionary St. Willibrord, set out on their mission to convert the pagans of Frisia and Germany from the monastery of Rathmelsigi in County Carlow. So this is all that remains of Rathmelsigi or Clonmelch, this rather forlorn cross. The head's been put back on it since this photo, but it was a very important monastic centre, and around the same area that Columbanus himself came from. So the final saint, Kilian, whose cafe we're in, he left Ireland with 11 companions in the 680s. Now, the Passio Kiliani, written more than 100 years after the martyrdom of the saint, simply notes that Kilian was born in Ireland and that he was held in esteem by the clergy and the people, who are greatly devoted to the Christian religion. He was moved by hearing a passage in the Gospel of Luke to undertake exile for Christ, to leave everything behind. The more detailed Passio Secunda Kiliani, written in the later 9th century, notes that he travelled to Britain first before travelling to France. And it mentions that he actually goes on Rome on pilgrimage to seek permission to preach to the pagans at Gentes, but was moved to seek permission from Pope John V. When they arrived in Rome, Pope John had died and Pope Conon had been elected, a very short reigning pope. The Pope gave Kilian permission to evangelize on hearing from where he came from, so Ireland, and he returned to Würzburg, where he is said to have converted the Duke Gosbert. As the Duke had married the wife of his brother, Kilian asked him to dismiss her, which he agreed to do. But Gailana had Kilian and 2 companions beheaded at night and secretly buried. The Duke Gosbert was later killed by his own men and his line wiped out, while Gailana was possessed by an evil spirit and soon died. So this is showing Kilian on the bridge in Würzburg with the Marienberg up above. And of course the feast day, the Kiliani, is still very much a feature of Würzburg and the whole area of Franconia, where they celebrate his feast day on the 8th of July every year. And this is the reliquary here showing the 3 heads, the 3 beheaded heads of Kilian and his 2 deacons who were martyred. The relics were later translated and during the time around 752-53. So the Passio was written much later to the events it recounts in the late 7th century. The focus is on Kilian as a missionary preacher, bishop, and martyr. The Franconian author shows little interest or knowledge about Ireland, merely praising the devotedness of the Irish, which is shown in the prompt reception of Kilian by the Pope. But the author of the later Passio Secunda does note that Ireland was once condemned for being a hotbed of Pelagian heresy. The Passio Secunda is more detailed and interested in Ireland, also noting that prior to leaving Ireland, Kilian was a monk and abbot, not a bishop. This is so we see the 2 names that are often used for Ireland: Scotia and Hibernia. Hibernia, land of winter, the old Roman name, and Scotia, the later name. And of course, that Scotland today, that comes from Scotia. So Kilian is one of the few Irish martyrs from the early Middle Ages, and the focus is on Kilian's martyrdom and not his place of origin, although there's a greater interest in the later Passio Secunda. This interest in martyrdom during the Carolingian period is reflected in the interest shown in the martyrdom of the monk Blathmach and his companions on Iona by Vikings, and the subsequent hagiography written by Walafrid Strabo in southern Germany, showing the dynamism of the links between the Irish Church and this region of southern Germany. And this is showing what's known Martyrs' Bay on Iona, where 68 monks were martyred here on the beach by Vikings in 806 AD. So just to conclude, Irish identity and the concept of the Irish nation was already present at the close of the 6th century and is evident from texts written in the 7th century. Thomas O'Loughlin and Patrick Wadden have both shown the role of Patrick's late 7th century hagiographers in portraying the Irish as a people formed by the conversion to Christianity through the apostolic mission of Patrick. Werku saw Christianity in terms of a community, a new people, and the need to see salvation in communal rather than individualistic terms. His account of Patrick's lighting the Easter Vigil fire on the Hill of Slane in defiance of the High King is seen in terms of Patrick's baptizing the whole island and nation. The Irish are referred to as Hibernenses in Tyrconnell and are contrasted with other barbarian peoples, Barbarigentes, making Tyrconnell's statement one of the most striking early medieval assertions of Irish national identity. This sense of common Irish identity was also reflected in the vernacular and legal texts of the 7th century, demonstrating a common ancestry, language, and law of the Irish people, modelled on Israel and the Old Testament. Although there is evidence for ethnic variety and plurality before Irish ethnogenesis consolidated in the 7th century in response to church concerns as gens, people, and ecclesia become synonymous, in both Anglo-Saxon England and in Ireland, this process was both linked to the apostolic role of Pope Gregory the Great in the case of England and Patrick in the case of Ireland. In the race to claim ecclesiastic precedence in the 7th century, Armagh, which was founded by Patrick, triumphed over Kildare, which was linked to St. Bridget, claims by in part outgunning them in producing a series of works of hagiography and by a political alliance with the most powerful Irish dynasty, the Enail. As Patrick Wadden noted, the rapid spread of Patrick's cult, propelled by Armagh, promoted also the concept of Irish national identity, which the Seancas Mór, Ireland's most important law book, written between 660 and 680 at Armagh, uses the phrase the island of Ireland and this island, reflecting Armagh's network of churches spread throughout the island. So having been converted by their national apostle and awaiting his future judgment, the people of Ireland were to be united on earth as a national church under the authority of his successors at Armagh. And this idea that Patrick will judge the Irish, we find this already in the 7th century hagiography, that he has special permission to judge the Irish at the last day. So you better be good to him. So the 7th century was really foundational to the development of Irish ethnic identity. And what I've tried to show as well in this lecture is that the role of Christianity and the church in the formation of Ireland and the Irish really is they're both indelibly linked. It was during this century that biblical models of ethnicity and divine election through baptism and conversion to Christianity helped consolidate and shape the emergence of the idea of the Irish as a unified people. This was promoted and advanced by churchmen at Armagh and other church centres where the cult of Patrick as Ireland's national apostle was promoted and fostered. And if you haven't already watched the wonderful film documentary I Am Patrick, this still is taken from, it was on Netflix, but do watch it. It's a brilliant film documentary about Patrick and about his writings. That's really, really well done by an American production company. The commemoration and celebration of Patrick in the liturgy on his feast day on the 17th of March in different places undoubtedly contributed to this forming of a national community. And I'm very aware that my lecture this evening has been focused on essentially 4 men. But I should note in conclusion that the most popular Irish saint in the Middle Ages was St. Bridget, far and away. And she was particularly seen in terms of hospitality and reception of pilgrims. So a lot of the kind of pilgrim hostels that were established on the continent for Irish are dedicated to St. Bridget. And so this idea of hospitality. But she's way more popular than Patrick. Okay, so thank you very much.